Hey guys, it's Chris Nichols here from Bow River Trout Fitters. Today, Elliot and I are on the Bow River here. We've got a beautiful April morning. As you can see, incredibly sunny, very bright t-shirt weather. It's pretty fantastic. But what we want to show you today is two different ways that we like to nymph the bow. Now, classically, a lot of people like to fish the Bow River under an indicator. Here in Alberta with our current regs, we can fish up to 3 flies. So it can be very productive, but it can also be quite a difficult task to actually cast and fish. But we're going to show you how to indicator nymph here on the Bow River today. But as well, I want to show you basically tight line nymphing techniques. Now, this has a lot of similarities to Euro nymphing and Euro nymph techniques. We use a lot of the same tackle, but we do change things up again for our bigger fish here. We like to fish a little bit differently than classic Euro nymphing. So I'm going to show you 2 ways to have a lot of fun nymphing the bow, having a productive day out. Hopefully we'll catch some fish here today, and you guys will learn a thing or two. Now, whether you're indicator fishing or tightline nymphing, the first thing I want to talk about is rod choice. And you can absolutely get away with a good 9-foot 5 or 6 weight rod. Some people even like to fish a little bit heavier, like a 7 weight, especially if you're throwing heavier lead shot weight, maybe 2 or 3 flies on an indicator rig. You might want that extra power to turn those flies over. But what we're finding now is a lot of people are looking at more dedicated nymphing rods, and these will typically be a little bit lighter and they'll definitely be longer. I'm using a 10-foot 4 weight Sage X that I built, and I'm finding that really nice whether I'm trying to turn over lighter indicator rigs or tightline nymph. And then you can take it to the extreme. If you get into Euro nymphing, a lot of those rods will be 2 or 3 weight rods, and they'll start to push 10.5 feet or even 11 feet. Having that extra distance gives you a couple advantages. Now, first off, when you're tightline nymphing, gives you a little bit more reach to control those flies and get it just a little bit further out into the water, and that can make a big difference. But even if you're indicator fishing, I like the extra length because it gives you a really nice ability to mend line effectively and to roll cast, which is, again, great when you're fishing up against the bank. So look for a little bit more of a stout rod, but definitely a longer rod if you want to get something that's made ideally for nymphing. And when you're tightline nymphing, you want a totally different rig setup, different fly line, different leaders, because it's a very different way of fishing. The first thing to remember about tightline nymphing is that you are controlling the depth of the flies with the tip of your rod. You've got a direct connection from the tip of the rod right to the flies, and you're holding the weight of the reel, the rod, the line, all out with one arm as you lead it through the run. Now, if you've got really heavy gear, bulky fly line, all that kind of stuff, it can get a little bit heavy. So a lot of guys will actually set up their rig as light as possible. But the other thing you want to keep in mind is that any weight, any heavy fly line from the rod tip to the flies, gravity is going to pull that heavy fly line as it sags, and it's going to pull on your flies, it's going to pull them out of the strike zone, and it's not going to look natural to the fish. So it's very important that the connection from the rod tip to the flies is as light and thin as possible. Okay, so first things first, I'm going to start from the flies and actually work our way back to the reel. As far as the mono goes to attach my flies to my leader, although a lot of Euro nymphers like to use 5X or 6X because it cuts through the water really quickly, I find that especially with bigger fish here in the Bow River, you end up having to overplay them. It's not good for the fish. I still like to use heavier fluoro, 8 or 10 pound, the same stuff that I would use for indicator rigs. That way I can put a little bit more muscle on the fish and I'm not going to break off flies as often. I do use fluorocarbon though because it does sink faster than nylon, and that's very important trying to get those flies down. Now the next thing I'm going to have is my leader, but I'm not using a classic 9-foot leader. What I'm going to use is something like a Rio Euro nymph leader, and this is very thin, fairly stiff mono, and then it has interchanging colors. Pink and green is what I'm using here today, and that's really useful because first off, you can really see it, and you're going to primarily rely on that to see a fish strike, but also I like that with those alternating colors, I can get it right at the depth I want or adjust the depth quickly just by grades of color, and I find that quite easy to do. It doesn't really have a taper because when we're tightline nymphing, your casting is going to be fairly limp, you're not able to cast very far, and you honestly can't control flies at long distances anyway. So it's going to just be a thin, straight Rio indicator. From that, it's going to attach to my fly line. Now, I can use a standard fly line, a weight forward fly line for my rod, but again, if there's any of that fly line coming out of the rod tip, if I may be fishing further away, the weight of that's going to pull. So what I really like to use is either a dedicated Euro nymphing fly line, which is incredibly thin, but I actually prefer to just use a shorter section of something like the Rio Euro Nymph Shorty product. This is basically a coated fly line that's very, very thin, but it's only about 20 feet long. I attach that to end of my standard fly line. then that goes out the rod tip, and then that goes to my indicator leader. And the great thing about that is if I want to then fish dry flies or an indicator rig, I don't have to change spools or change line. I simply take off that 20-foot section, that Euronymph shorty, and I can go back to using my standard fly line. So for versatility, that's the best choice. I'm just going to get my flies into the column that I want to fish, let them sink a little bit, and I'm going to get that direct connection with it. I'm taking up the slack, but I want a little bit of slack in the line, and I want to keep the rod tip generally above the flies or ahead of the flies. Now, what's great about this is because you have a fairly tight connection, if I see that line straighten out, if I see it dip, or if I just feel it right in the rod tip, it's very sensitive when you're directly connected to it, I lift the rod and there'll be a fish there. So what's nice about tight line nymphing is you have a much faster reaction time to fish actually striking, and it gives you something to do mentally as well, as you're basically feeling the bottom of the river, feeling the structure, just using the rod and watching the line. You start to develop a really good mental picture of what the structure's like underneath. When you do get a fish on, it's an immediate hit and it's a lot of fun. Now when it comes to indicator nymph fishing, I'm going to start from the reel and actually work our way down to the flies this time. Now when it comes to fly line choice, a lot of people just use a standard weight forward line, but we prefer nymph tapers like the Airflow Kelly Galloup nymph line, for example. What they're going to have is a fairly weight forward short front taper, so it's a lot of power to turn over heavy rigs, but they'll still have a fairly long head. And what that means is when you've got your nymphs out there 30 feet, 35 feet, for example, you still have a good amount of bulk right at the rod tip so that you can mend really gracefully. That is such an important part of the process when you are indicator nymph fishing. Now, the other thing you're going to set up then is a nice leader. Check out our video at the end of this video where we talk about how to set up a nymph rig. That'll actually show you exactly how we like to set up our leaders. But the main idea is this. You want to have an indicator set on your leader so that you can adjust the height that your flies are going to drift. This is very important. If you're not adjusting your indicator on a regular basis, you're not going to have any success. You want your flies near the bottom or just ticking off the bottom, but you don't want too much slack that they're getting hung up or you're missing takes, and you don't want too little distance where the flies are now up in the water column and the fish aren't targeting them. You need to adjust on a regular basis. We personally really like, again, Airflow airlock indicators. They're easy to adjust up and down. You can take them off and put them back on other parts of your leader section. Really nice, and they don't tangle very much and they don't kink up your leader. Now when it comes to casting your nymph rig out there, it shouldn't be pretty. You actually want to open up your loop. None of these tight loops that look really pretty but are going to tangle up your rig constantly. Open up the loop, get those almost more like a lob than an actual cast. And as you get those nymphs into the column you want to fish, we often like to do an upstream reach or mend right away. And it is very important that you don't let a belly form in the line below your indicator, because that's going to pull the flies through the column faster than the water's traveling, and the fish aren't going to like that. So you need to be able to mend, get very good at mending upstream casts, trying to move that indicator as little as possible, get those mends above the indicator so that it's flowing naturally with the current. And if your line starts to form a belly again, put another mend in there. Keep mending to get that indicator moving as little as possible. So you've got your nymphs up in the water column, you've adjusted your indicators so they're just off the bottom, and you're doing upstream mends to make sure that it's not getting pulled by the current. Last thing you need to figure out is, what is a fish take on your indicator? So at the start, you're going to see the indicator bobbing and moving, and you really should probably hit on every little movement you see. Eventually, with practice, you'll start to realize what is a fish and what is the bottom of the river. Typically, though, what you're going to notice is small hesitations and bumps. Well, that might just be a rock, and you can just gently lift the rod, and if you feel some weight on there, give it a set. If not, just pull it off the rock and keep it drifting. But look for things like the indicator moving in a rapid direction that's not with the current. Maybe it goes left, maybe it goes right, maybe it just hesitates and stops. Those can all be fish takes. Maybe it goes downstream faster than the current all of a sudden. Hit on those things. And what I like to do, I don't set like a monster like I'm fishing for bass. I do like to set fairly gently, do a lift, because if it's not a fish and if it is just a rock or a bump, you don't want to pull that indicator out of the column. You can keep the drift going if you don't strike too hard. If you see that take though, better to be safe than sorry. Strike on it, and if there's nothing there, lob those nymphs up and drift again. All right, well, thanks for joining us today on the river. We got a nice rainbow out here. It's been a beautiful day. If you have any questions about what we're doing here in this video, leave them in the comments below and we'll happily answer them. Please check out BowRiverTroutFitters.com. We've got lots of the gear that you need to make nymphing successful, lots of fly tying videos on our YouTube channel as well. So please check those out. Thanks so much for joining us. We'll see you guys soon.